People often imagine that great fortunes are built in boardrooms through polished speeches, legal teams, and corporate strategy. But every once in a while, a rise begins in a place most people overlook: small roadside pitches, muddy fields, and handshake deals made around caravans. Maurice "Fred" Sines didn't come from wealth, privilege, or formal education. Yet by the time his name began appearing in newspapers, he had already built a multi-million-pound presence in Britain's caravan site industry. His story isn't one of glamour or high-end business meetings, but of relentless hustling, instinctive risk-taking, and a belief that if he couldn't read the paperwork, he'd simply rely on people and his own memory to get ahead. Starting from where the hook ends, his early life unfolds in a world far removed from traditional classrooms or structured business training. Born in the mid-1960s within Britain's traveling community, Sines grew up surrounded by traders, dealers, and constant movement. Money was rarely steady, but opportunities were everywhere, provided you had the nerve and the intuition to spot them. He learned early that conversations were more valuable than textbooks, that being observant mattered more than being educated, and that confidence could close a deal faster than any written contract. While other children studied vocabulary and arithmetic, Sines studied people, their intentions, their habits, the small tells in their negotiations. This ability to read situations became the foundation for everything he would later build. As a boy, he took whatever work he could find, cleaning windows, tidying lots, and doing minor repair tasks for anyone willing to pay a few coins. Every pound he earned was saved rather than spent, because even then he seemed to understand that money wasn't meant to be celebrated, it was meant to be multiplied. He began purchasing small bits of unused land, sometimes through simple agreements, and often through conversations with people who were eager to offload a piece of property they didn't want to maintain. He relied heavily on verbal communication, memory, and trust, not because he preferred it, but because he didn't yet have the literacy skills that paperwork required. Still, he managed to turn these limitations into motivators, pushing him to work harder, speak more directly, and understand deals in ways others didn't. His first profit came almost by accident. After buying a modest patch of land for a small sum, he discovered that others were willing to pay a markup simply because they needed a temporary space for caravans or small trading stands. That single flip sparked something in him, a realization that land, no matter how small or unimpressive, could be a stepping stone to something larger. Over time, he repeated the process: buy land, improve it just enough to make it usable, and sell it on or rent it out. Soon, he was in regular communication with people who owned land, needed land, or wanted to move their businesses to areas with better access. Word spread quickly that Sines was a man who could connect the right person with the right site at the right time. What began as a few isolated deals gradually transformed into a small operation. He had no formal plan, no written blueprint, but he had momentum, and momentum in his world was everything. By his late teens and early 20s, he was dealing more regularly, often traveling between counties, visiting caravan parks, and buying small plots that others overlooked. Many of these sites weren't glamorous: uneven ground, unpaved areas, patches of overgrowth, and spaces that required weeks of work before they could be used. But Sines didn't see inconvenience, he saw potential. He understood that people in the traveling and trading communities needed functional land, not polished real estate. If he could provide that function, customers would arrive. As he gained experience, he also gained confidence. His deals became larger, the land parcels more valuable, and the networks stronger. Though he didn't rely on written documentation himself, he surrounded himself with people who could handle the legal and administrative side, allowing him to maintain focus on negotiation and development. What stood out during this period was his ability to communicate. Sines was known for his directness, sometimes firm, sometimes charismatic, but always practical. He valued commitment and expected others to honor their word just as he honored his. In the traveling community, where reputations spread quickly, this approach helped him maintain reliability among those who bought from him or partnered with him. As the 1990s approached, his operations began to look less like a series of small trades and more like a business network. Caravan sites were expanding, rental spaces were increasing, and he was reinvesting aggressively into new opportunities. Even without conventional education, he had developed a strong understanding of supply, demand, and value, particularly within communities that relied on mobility and flexible living arrangements. Yet what defined his early rise wasn't luck or extraordinary access, it was consistency. He didn't see himself as a millionaire in the making, he simply followed the method he believed in: find a space, understand what people need from it, improve it, and then let the market do the rest. His background may not have included degrees or diplomas, but the lessons he absorbed through lived experience shaped him into an operator who understood the rhythm of deals intimately. As his wealth grew, so did the conversations around him. Larger investors took notice, law firms were involved more frequently, and councils across different regions began interacting with him as his sites expanded. But through it all, the core remained the same: a man who built everything piece by piece, site by site, through a lifetime of observation and instinct. His early life, from childhood hustles to his first land flips, reveals a portrait of a figure who rose not through conventional means, but through sheer determination and entrepreneurial grit. Those beginnings would eventually evolve into larger ventures and later serious legal challenges. But in the early chapters of his story, what stands out most is the drive of a man who refused to let limitations define his potential.
And as Maurice Sines moved from small parcels of land to larger ventures, his focus shifted toward building a more substantial presence through caravan parks and property development. By this stage, his early lessons in observation, instinct, and negotiation were no longer sufficient on their own. He needed to scale operations while still relying on the networks, trust, and reputation he had cultivated over the years. This meant understanding not only the value of individual plots, but also the broader trends within the traveling and semi-permanent housing communities, knowing which locations would be profitable, and learning how to manage multiple sites simultaneously. While Sines never relied on formal paperwork in his early years, at this stage he began working with legal advisors and administrative staff who could handle contracts, leases, and planning permissions, allowing him to focus on acquisition, development, and the practical management of his growing properties. His strategy was simple in concept but effective. Find land others overlooked, develop it just enough to make it functional for caravans or small businesses, and ensure a steady flow of renters or buyers. This approach allowed him to maximize profits without relying on conventional methods or formal education. Over time, he established a reputation for being thorough in his management. Those who rented or bought from him often praised his attention to the practicalities of living and working on caravan sites. He understood that these communities valued accessibility, usability, and trustworthiness above polished presentation. By providing exactly what was needed, Sines was able to grow not only his revenue, but also his influence within the community. Each successful development led to larger projects, creating a cumulative effect that amplified his reach. Word-of-mouth recommendations became as valuable as advertising, particularly within the traveling network, where personal reputation carries significant weight. With multiple sites under his control, Sines also began negotiating partnerships and joint ventures, working with landowners, other business operators, and occasionally local authorities. His approach was pragmatic. Agreements were based on mutual benefit, clear expectations, and personal integrity, rather than relying solely on contracts or formal legal structures. This allowed him to move quickly on opportunities and maintain control over projects without getting bogged down in bureaucracy.
One of the key aspects of Sines' expansion was his ability to see potential where others did not. Many of his sites were considered undesirable because they required investment, cleanup, or preparation. While others dismissed these plots as unprofitable, he recognized that with modest improvements and careful management, these same sites could become reliable sources of income. This mindset, combined with his growing network of contacts, enabled him to scale his operations efficiently. His ability to negotiate and communicate effectively played a critical role as the scope of his projects increased. Sines relied on personal interaction, understanding client needs, and reading situations instinctively to close deals that others might have considered too risky or complex. In this way, he leveraged skills he had developed during his youth, intuition, observation, and memory to handle increasingly larger and more complicated projects. Expansion also required Sines to understand the operational side of managing multiple sites. He had to coordinate maintenance, oversee staff, ensure compliance with local regulations, and maintain positive relationships with the surrounding community. While he did not approach these responsibilities through formal education, he applied a practical logic and a hands-on approach, often visiting sites personally, resolving disputes directly, and adapting quickly to unforeseen challenges. As his portfolio grew, so did scrutiny from outside observers. Media attention began to notice his rapidly expanding network of caravan parks, and some local authorities monitored developments more closely, especially where planning and zoning issues arose. While this introduced a layer of complexity to his operations, Sines adapted by ensuring that the practical functioning of his sites remained seamless, even if the broader perception was mixed. This period of expansion also marked his first encounters with larger financial considerations. Managing multiple sites required planning for cash flow, reinvestment, and long-term sustainability. Sines relied heavily on his instincts and experience to allocate resources efficiently, deciding which sites to develop, which to maintain, and which to sell or trade when opportunities presented themselves. He was increasingly viewed as a figure capable of turning undervalued land into profitable ventures, and this reputation attracted both allies and competitors. Managing relationships became just as important as managing properties. Sines developed an understanding of people's motivations, negotiating carefully to ensure cooperation without unnecessary conflict. This relational skill became an integral part of his business model, allowing him to maintain loyalty and trust across his operations even as scale increased. As Sines' caravan park empire took shape, his ventures began attracting more formal attention. Banks, investors, and legal advisors became part of the network, not because he sought them actively, but because his reputation and financial footprint demanded it. He navigated these relationships carefully, relying on his negotiation skills to maintain control while allowing the necessary administrative support to function efficiently. By combining intuition, practical management, and strategic partnerships, Sines successfully transitioned from a small-scale operator into a significant figure within Britain's caravan and property market. His story during this phase is not one of sudden wealth or flashy success. It is one of incremental growth, careful observation, and applying experience learned over decades. Each site, each deal, each interaction contributed to a broader understanding of the market, reinforcing the strategies that had served him since childhood. His journey through caravan parks and property development illustrates a pattern repeated in many entrepreneurial stories: an ability to see value where others do not, to take calculated risks, and to rely on personal skill rather than formal qualifications to achieve success. It is during this stage that Sines' rise becomes more than just an individual success story. It becomes a demonstration of how perseverance, adaptability, and careful observation can transform opportunities into tangible results. Every successful acquisition or development reinforced the principles he had learned in his early years: trust relationships, observe carefully, act decisively, and reinvest strategically. These principles underpinned the empire he was building and laid the foundation for the later events in his life, both the accomplishments and the challenges that would follow. By the end of this period, Sines had established a network of sites and properties that formed a recognizable business footprint. Though still operating within the informal methods of his upbringing, he had successfully scaled from a handful of small plots to a collection of well-managed caravan parks, illustrating both his resourcefulness and his capacity to adapt practical knowledge to increasingly complex ventures. His story at this stage exemplifies the transition from instinct-based operations to a structured network that, while still informal in some ways, relied on partnerships, management, and practical oversight to achieve measurable growth.
And while Maurice Sines' empire of caravan parks and property holdings continued to grow, it inevitably drew attention from outside observers, including local authorities, journalists, and members of the public. Expansion on this scale, particularly when it originated from informal methods rather than structured corporate processes, almost always invites scrutiny. For Sines, the increased visibility meant navigating not only the operational challenges of multiple sites, but also the growing pressures of legal oversight, regulatory compliance, and public curiosity. As his business ventures became more prominent, a pattern emerged where his past informal approach occasionally collided with the expectations of formal systems. Though he had successfully relied on instinct, personal relationships, and practical negotiation for decades, interactions with courts, councils, and regulatory bodies required documentation, evidence, and adherence to rules that were sometimes unfamiliar to him. These legal and administrative challenges began subtly at first: minor planning disputes, disagreements over land use, and local inspections that questioned the conditions of certain sites. While many operators might have been overwhelmed by these requirements, Sines applied the same principles that had guided his early ventures: observation, careful listening, and negotiation. He relied on advisors and intermediaries to handle technical paperwork, while personally maintaining oversight of the broader strategy, ensuring that his vision for each site remained intact. As public attention intensified, media outlets began reporting on his rapidly expanding network. Stories ranged from neutral descriptions of his business ventures to more critical examinations of how he managed sites or acquired properties. Some coverage focused on the sheer speed and scale of his growth, highlighting that an individual without formal education had achieved what many professionally trained developers had not. Other reports explored disputes, complaints from neighbors, or local council interventions, portraying a more complex picture of his operations. These public narratives contributed to a broader sense of scrutiny, shaping how Sines had to operate both practically and socially. It became increasingly important to maintain the appearance of professionalism, even if the internal management remained grounded in personal relationships and informal methods. Alongside media attention, legal matters began to take a more prominent role. Certain transactions and developments were challenged, sometimes due to questions about land titles, planning permissions, or contractual interpretations. Sines had to navigate these challenges carefully, balancing his instinctive approach with formal processes to protect his business interests. While he had long relied on verbal agreements and trust-based arrangements, legal scrutiny demanded tangible evidence, formal records, and structured negotiation. This required adaptation, not a complete change of method, but an integration of formal procedures into his existing practices. One aspect that complicated his position was the scale of his network. With multiple sites across different counties, each with its own rules, inspectors, and local governance, coordinating compliance became increasingly complex. Sines needed to ensure that while operations continued smoothly, any potential legal or regulatory issues were addressed promptly. This period required not just operational skill, but strategic foresight, anticipating where scrutiny might emerge and preparing responses in advance. Journalists covering his story were particularly interested in the juxtaposition between his background and his current standing. They highlighted how someone without formal schooling could rise to become a recognizable figure in the property and caravan park sector, achieving a financial footprint that rivaled much larger, more conventionally structured enterprises.
This coverage, while sometimes critical, also reinforced Sines' image as a self-made figure whose achievements were rooted in observation, negotiation, and resilience. Public scrutiny extended beyond media attention to the perceptions of the communities in which he operated. Neighbors, tenants, and local businesses were all stakeholders who reacted to changes in land use, management decisions, and expansion plans. Maintaining positive relationships with these groups became crucial, not only for practical management, but also for mitigating complaints that could escalate into formal legal challenges. In this environment, Sines relied on a hands-on approach. He visited sites personally, met with tenants, addressed concerns, and ensured that agreements were respected. His reputation for direct, practical problem-solving became a key asset in maintaining trust and minimizing friction, even under increasing public and legal attention. At the same time, legal cases related to his operations began drawing on evidence from a wide array of sources. Documentation, witness statements, site inspections, and correspondence all contributed to a growing record of his activities. While some of these matters involved minor disputes, others carried the potential for more significant consequences, highlighting the tension between informal methods and formal legal requirements. Navigating this tension required both strategic thinking and adaptability. Sines had to reconcile his instinctive, experience-based approach with the demands of structured processes and oversight, a challenge he met by delegating administrative tasks while personally ensuring alignment with his vision. The combination of public scrutiny, media exposure, and legal attention created an environment in which mistakes could be amplified. Every decision, whether about expansion, site management, or partnerships, was observed and interpreted by multiple audiences. Maintaining credibility became as important as operational success. Sines' early skills in negotiation, observation, and relationship building were now applied in a different context, managing perception, responding to inquiries, and ensuring that his empire continued to function smoothly despite external pressures. Over time, these challenges also provided lessons in risk management and foresight. Each dispute or legal query became an opportunity to refine procedures, improve record-keeping, and anticipate potential complications. Sines' ability to learn from these situations while still leveraging the strengths that had guided his rise, practical knowledge, instinct, and relationship management, enabled him to continue growing his operations even under heightened scrutiny. The interplay of media, public attention, and legal oversight highlighted a broader truth about his trajectory. Success in unconventional circumstances often attracts scrutiny, and adaptation becomes essential. Sines' story during this phase illustrates the balance between maintaining the practices that generated initial success and integrating structures required to navigate the formal systems of law, media, and public perception. As his network of caravan parks matured, the outcomes of these interactions shaped both his operational methods and his public image. He had to constantly negotiate between efficiency and compliance, between instinct and procedure, between private strategy and public accountability.
And as Maurice Sines navigated the increasing scrutiny from media, public attention, and legal oversight, he also faced the growing complexity of his business networks and associations. By this stage, his operations were no longer limited to isolated caravan sites. They had grown into a series of interconnected ventures, partnerships, and informal agreements that spanned multiple counties. Each connection required careful attention because in the world of business, particularly one built outside conventional corporate structures, associations can be both an asset and a liability. Sines relied heavily on a network of contacts who shared his vision, trusted his judgment, or simply respected his reputation. These relationships were not formalized in the way corporate contracts might dictate. Instead, they were often built on mutual benefit, personal integrity, and long-standing familiarity. He understood the importance of maintaining these connections and nurturing trust because they allowed him to expand more quickly and gain access to opportunities that would otherwise be unavailable.
The larger and more complex his network became, the more effort was required to ensure that all parties remained aligned and that his operations continued smoothly. Within this framework, Sines had to carefully evaluate who could be trusted, what partnerships were strategically advantageous, and where potential risks lay. Some relationships were straightforward, such as joint ventures in property development or co-managed caravan sites, while others were more nuanced, involving shared knowledge, mutual introductions, and coordinated investments. Each relationship carried weight, as even minor disputes or misunderstandings could cascade into operational challenges or legal inquiries. Part of Sines' skill during this period was his ability to read people and situations with the same instinctive acuity that had guided his early land flips. He knew which partnerships were worth investing time in, which required more oversight, and which were best approached cautiously. These decisions were informed by years of experience in environments where reputation mattered more than formal credentials, and where trust was often the currency that facilitated transactions. Alongside his personal network, Sines also had to manage interactions with authorities, legal advisors, and regulatory bodies. These interactions required a different kind of relationship building, one rooted not in instinct alone, but in strategic compliance and negotiation. He learned to balance the need for cooperation with the desire to maintain operational autonomy, ensuring that regulatory requirements were met without compromising the flexibility that had allowed him to grow so effectively in the first place. The interplay of these networks, personal, professional, and institutional, highlighted a central challenge for Sines. Growth in unconventional business models is rarely linear. Opportunities come with strings attached, partnerships can introduce unforeseen complications, and even long-standing allies can become sources of tension. To navigate this, Sines continued to rely on the principles that had guided his rise: careful observation, practical problem-solving, and decisive action. At the same time, the broader environment in which he operated demanded that he pay attention to public perception and media narratives. As his empire expanded, journalists and local communities increasingly scrutinized not only his business activities, but also his associations. Who he partnered with, how he negotiated deals, and which projects he undertook became part of the story, reinforcing the need for careful management of both operations and reputation. This dual focus, managing internal networks while considering external perception, added a layer of complexity that required strategic planning and foresight. Sines' approach combined hands-on management of day-to-day operations with careful attention to the broader implications of his associations. He maintained direct oversight of sites and deals, visiting locations personally, resolving conflicts, and ensuring standards were met. Simultaneously, he evaluated how each connection or partnership could impact his overall strategy, reputation, and long-term objectives. This required balancing immediate operational concerns with the long-term implications of every association. One of the most significant aspects of this period was the way Sines leveraged his network to create stability and resilience. By surrounding himself with reliable partners, advisors, and contacts, he could pursue larger projects and manage more properties than would have been possible alone. His network also provided access to knowledge, resources, and opportunities that might have otherwise been inaccessible, effectively amplifying his capacity for growth. Yet alongside these advantages, the complexity of his network introduced vulnerabilities. Miscommunications, disputes, or the actions of others within his circle had the potential to create challenges, particularly when legal or regulatory scrutiny increased. Sines had to remain vigilant, monitoring developments closely and intervening when necessary to protect both his operations and reputation. Another element of this phase involved understanding the limits and responsibilities associated with each association. Sines recognized that some partnerships required hands-on involvement, while others could function autonomously if aligned with shared goals. Delegating responsibility effectively allowed him to scale operations without compromising quality or control. At the same time, maintaining strong communication and oversight ensured that all parts of the network were working in concert, reducing the likelihood of conflicts or misunderstandings. The complexity of these networks also provided opportunities for innovation and expansion. By identifying complementary skills, resources, or expertise within his circle, Sines was able to pursue projects that extended beyond simple caravan site management, including property development, land improvement, and investment strategies that capitalized on market trends. These ventures required careful coordination, negotiation, and strategic foresight, which all depended on the strength and reliability of his associations. Throughout this period, Sines' ability to read people, assess opportunities, and maintain trust became even more critical. The scale and complexity of his operations meant that decisions had ripple effects across multiple sites, partners, and communities. Each choice required balancing risk and reward, short-term objectives and long-term strategy, and personal judgment with external expectations. His success in managing these dynamics demonstrated not only his operational skill, but also his capacity for strategic thinking in a highly fluid and interconnected environment. At the same time, the network he built helped him navigate increasing external pressures. Legal scrutiny, media coverage, and community attention all demanded careful attention. Strong associations provided support, advice, and context, enabling Sines to respond effectively to challenges without losing focus on growth and operational efficiency. Ultimately, this period of his story illustrates the central importance of networks and relationships in sustaining business growth, particularly for operators working outside traditional corporate structures. Sines' ability to cultivate, manage, and leverage these associations allowed him to expand his empire, mitigate risks, and maintain resilience in the face of scrutiny. His story is a study in how personal skill, judgment, and relational intelligence can shape outcomes as significantly as capital, formal education, or institutional support, highlighting the intricate interplay between personal connections, operational strategy, and public perception in the trajectory of a complex, unconventional business enterprise.
And as Maurice Sines' networks and associations became firmly established, the next phase of his journey involved facing the long-term consequences of his decisions, both in business and in public perception. By this stage, the empire he had built through caravan parks, property development, and land acquisitions was no longer just a series of individual ventures. It had become a recognizable footprint in multiple communities, attracting attention from regulators, local authorities, and the media. Every choice he had made in expanding operations, managing relationships, and cultivating networks now carried implications that extended far beyond immediate profits or local reputation. The long-term consequences were not sudden or dramatic, but instead unfolded gradually, demonstrating how the interplay between personal decisions, operational strategy, and external scrutiny can shape the trajectory of even the most carefully managed enterprises. One of the primary consequences involved financial and operational sustainability. As Sines' network of sites grew, managing cash flow, reinvestment, and ongoing maintenance became increasingly complex. Sites required constant attention to remain functional and appealing to tenants, and any lapse in oversight could result in decreased revenue or complaints from residents. Balancing expansion with the resources available demanded careful planning, strategic delegation, and practical oversight. Mistakes or delays in these areas could affect profitability, partnerships, and overall stability, making operational discipline a central focus of his later career. Alongside financial consequences, Sines also faced reputational implications. By the time his operations were widely known, his name had become a topic of public discussion. Media coverage, whether highlighting the scale of his empire or questioning aspects of his business practices, shaped how communities and potential partners perceived him.
While some narratives celebrated his ingenuity and rise from humble beginnings, others scrutinized his methods, emphasizing disputes or legal challenges. Managing reputation became an ongoing concern, requiring him to balance transparency, operational integrity, and strategic communication. Legal and regulatory outcomes formed another significant consequence of his choices. Expanding operations inevitably led to interactions with planning authorities, local councils, and other regulatory bodies. Each engagement carried the potential for disputes, compliance requirements, or formal investigations. Sines' response to these matters involved a combination of delegation to legal advisors and personal oversight, ensuring that regulatory obligations were met without compromising the core strategies that had driven his growth. These interactions demonstrated the importance of adaptability in navigating complex environments where rules, procedures, and expectations intersect with entrepreneurial activity. Beyond operations and reputation, the human dimension of his empire also created long-term implications. Employees, partners, tenants, and associates all relied on the stability and predictability of his management. Decisions made in one part of the network could influence the experiences of others, highlighting the interconnectedness of his responsibilities. Maintaining trust and demonstrating consistent leadership became essential to sustaining the functionality of his growing enterprise. The combination of financial, reputational, legal, and relational consequences created a multifaceted environment in which Sines had to operate. Each decision required careful assessment of potential outcomes, balancing immediate benefits against long-term sustainability. Strategic thinking, observation, and adaptability, which had served him from his earliest ventures, continued to be central to his success in managing these complex dynamics. Another long-term consequence involved sustainability of his business model itself. Operating largely outside traditional corporate structures, relying on personal networks and practical knowledge, meant that growth and continuity were intimately tied to his presence, judgment, and oversight. While partnerships and delegated management allowed for expansion, the core strength of the enterprise rested on his ability to coordinate, problem-solve, and make decisive choices. This reliance on personal oversight created both an advantage in terms of responsiveness and flexibility and a vulnerability in terms of dependence on one individual's capacity to manage multiple moving parts. Public perception and community impact remained an ongoing concern. As the scale of his operations increased, local communities became more aware of his presence, and their experiences with his sites could influence broader perceptions. Positive experiences reinforced credibility and trust, while disputes or dissatisfaction could attract attention, complaints, or regulatory intervention. This dynamic required ongoing engagement, responsiveness, and careful management to maintain operational stability and public goodwill. Over time, the culmination of these consequences also highlighted the broader lesson of cumulative decision-making. Choices made early in his career, how he acquired land, the types of partnerships he pursued, the manner in which he managed sites, had lasting effects on later outcomes. Decisions about site management, legal compliance, and public engagement could not be viewed in isolation. They were part of a continuum that shaped the trajectory of his empire and the consequences he ultimately faced. At the same time, his ability to adapt, learn from challenges, and integrate new structures and processes into his operations reflected an ongoing commitment to problem-solving, observation, and practical management. These qualities mitigated some consequences and allowed for continued growth despite challenges. Another aspect of the long-term consequences involved strategic planning for succession and sustainability. As his network of sites expanded, he had to consider not only immediate operations, but also how to ensure the continuity and stability of his empire beyond his direct involvement. delegating responsibility, training associates, and establishing systems for oversight became essential components of maintaining operational integrity over time. The combination of immediate management, strategic oversight, and long-term planning reflects a nuanced understanding of how complex enterprises evolve and the importance of proactive engagement with emerging challenges. Ultimately, this phase of Sines' story illustrates the multifaceted nature of consequences in entrepreneurial ventures that combine unconventional methods with significant growth. Financial, operational, reputational, legal, and relational outcomes all intersected, creating an environment in which careful planning, adaptability, and strategic foresight were necessary to sustain progress. By examining how he navigated these dynamics, one can understand the broader principles that underpin successful management of complex, non-traditional business networks. Sines' experience highlights that long-term consequences are rarely the result of a single decision or event. Rather, they accumulate over time, shaped by a combination of early choices, operational practices, relational strategies, and responses to external scrutiny. His story demonstrates how resilience, adaptability, and careful oversight can influence outcomes, and how even unconventional approaches to business require a consistent application of practical intelligence, observation, and judgment to manage the challenges and consequences that emerge over time. By the conclusion of this phase, Maurice Sines had not only built a significant property and caravan park network, but had also learned to navigate the broader implications of growth, demonstrating both the power and the responsibility inherent in managing a complex, unconventional enterprise. This stage of his journey reflects the culmination of decades of experience, insight, and strategic decision-making, providing a lens through which to understand the intricate balance between opportunity, risk, and consequence in entrepreneurial life.